Okay, hello everyone. So this podcast will look at Stephen Lee's essay, Was There a German Revolution, 1918 to 1919? Now he starts off by defining revolution, which is a pretty sensible start, and a workable definition, this one. To transfer power outside the constitutional process, a radical change to the political infrastructure, and revolution is often a process that is accelerated by war. So those are the sort of three key strands there. Now, the focusing in on the German Revolution of 1918 to 1919. Always, again, a useful starting point for an essay. Use as your anchor the traditional starting point. Okay, now the traditional interpretation, and just zooming in a little bit here, the traditional interpretation is that there was a revolution, but break it down into stages. Okay, so the traditional interpretation, Germany had two revolutions, which between them transformed the authoritarian structure of the Second Reich, the Kaiserreich, into an advanced democracy, the Weimar Republic, and that happened in two stages according to the traditional interpretation. Firstly, there was a revolution from above, which was the October Reform, which liberalised the constitution of the Second Reich, but proved to be too little too late. The second was a revolution from below, which consisted of two strands. Okay, so the first strand was the events of November 1918 that led to the abdication of the Kaiser on the 9th of November and the Republic being declared. And secondly, the events of January 1919, which was a failed attempt to establish a Bolshevik-style regime, which is obviously the Spartacist uprising. Okay, so Lee then moves into working his way through effectively those three different strands, and he starts off with an evaluation of the first strand. So this is about the October Reform of 1918, which was the apparent revolution from above. Now, again, a very logical approach. He starts off here, by simply stating what happened. It is easy to make the mistake of jumping into your analysis without actually stating what happened. So, without analysing it, what was the October Reform? Okay, it was initiated by the German High Command of the Army in September 1918, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who advised the Kaiser to hand power to Prince Max, of Baden. And Prince Max of Baden, in turn, initiated constitutional reforms on the 28th of October, which made the Chancellor responsible to the Reichstag. And also, the second change, members of the Reichstag could now become ministers. Okay. Next point, Lee argues or looks at the case that was a revolution. Okay, he's not saying he agrees with it, but he presents the argument. First of all, the constitution of the Second Reich had been significantly transformed. Okay, for the reasons we just said. Also, on the basis of the definition of the revolution, the changes were an outcome of the war and external pressures, imminent military disaster, an attempt to appease the Allies, etc. The counter-argument, though, of course, is that the October Reform was not a revolution. It could be argued that these changes would have happened anyway. There was pressure for constitutional change before World War I, and the war, therefore, merely accelerated a process that was already underway. In other words, that rather than it be called a revolution, Lee's very useful phrase, he says it was evolution by necessity, so that's a counter-argument. Now, Lee then moves on to the next revolution, okay, moving on a month, okay, and he uses a similar approach here. So the next revolution in November 1918, rather than jump into analysing it, let's just be clear exactly what the apparent revolution was. Okay, what happened in November 1918? Okay, well, there was a series of events protesting against the war, the Kiel Mutiny, followed rapidly by the creation of workers and soldiers' councils, the Soviets, spontaneous organisations run by the workers to organise their own affairs. And Prince Max, the Chancellor, persuaded the Kaiser to abdicate, which he did reluctantly on the 9th of November. And what then happened, of course, is the rulers of the other states, the King of Bavaria, etc., also stepped down, also abdicated. And then Prince Max, the Chancellor, handed over the Chancellorship to Hebert, and Hebert formed a caretaker government, a temporary government, until elections for a National Assembly could decide on a future constitution. Simultaneously, exactly the same time, the deputy leader of the SPD, Hebert's deputy, Philipp Scheidemann, declared the Second Reich to be dead and that Germany was now a republic. And then, 2 days later, on the 11th of November, Hebert signed the armistice. Germany surrendered. Now, according to this, there are four convincing arguments that the events of November 1918 were a real revolution. The events of November 1918 were a direct result of impending military defeat. Think about Lee's earlier definition. They were caused by increasing external pressure from America for unconditional surrender. Again, think about the definition. The military crisis and the pressure from the USA precipitated popular pressure from below to sweep away the October reforms, which is what the Kiel Mutiny was, and the formation of those Soviets, because the October reforms hadn't gone far enough, and they were pushing for the Kaiser to abdicate. Okay, so that also supports the notion that it was a revolution. And finally, and very importantly, the new arrangement of joint rule, the caretaker government that had been set up, was a power-sharing government where Hebert reluctantly shared power with the Council of People's Representatives, which was much more radical than anything that had been created by the October reforms. Effectively, it was power-sharing with the lower classes. Okay, so that's Lee's analysis of the first strand of the revolution from below, which was November 1918. Then, of course, and Lee, as you can see, he's pretty convinced that you could argue that was a revolution. But he then moves into the events 2 months later of January 1919, which was the Spartacist uprising. And here he presents a pretty convincing case that there was not revolutionary change. But again, let's just take a look at what happened. First of all, he deals with the argument that the Spartacist uprising was revolutionary. Okay. So Marxist-Leninist historians claim that the Spartacist uprising of January 1919, which of course failed, that Luxemburg and Liebknecht headed a genuine mass movement that was betrayed by the Social Democrats. Hebert, of course, colluded with General Groener to put down the Spartacists. But the argument is the Spartacists genuinely wanted revolutionary change. They wanted to transfer all political powers to workers' and soldiers' councils. They wanted Germany to associate closely with the Soviet Union. They wanted Germany to establish a workers' army, get rid of the existing army, and they wanted to collectivise agriculture and nationalise industry. So the intentions of the Spartacists were revolutionary. On the other hand, and this is where Lee tends to lie, having presented that argument, he then presents a counter-argument, and he says, actually, the Spartacists were not a revolutionary threat. He quotes the historians Coleman, Feldman and Klug, who've shown that the Spartacists did not control the workers' and soldiers' councils. They did not control the Soviets. So those spontaneous organisations that had been created in November 1918 to kind of run workers' affairs were not really revolutionary. Why not? Because they were dominated by members of the moderate SPD and also the USPD, which was also not fully revolutionary. The Soviets even included some middle classes. Okay, the Spartacists, who were revolutionary in their intentions, actually did not really control the Soviets. So, in other words, the objectives of the Soviets, the workers' councils that were formed, were on the whole very moderate. They were more really about getting food in their cupboard and sorting out economic problems than bringing about a change to the political system. So the Soviets were not revolutionary. The Spartacists were disorganised. They were never able to get influence in the Soviets, and of course their leaders also arguably did not even believe the time was right for revolution. They were drawn in to a very chaotic and uncontrolled situation. Okay, so having established then really that the Spartacist uprising was more an apparent revolution than a real revolution, and that it was effectively then put down by Hebert, working in alliance with Groener, Lee then moves on to analysing the next few months up to May 1919, in other words, analysing Hebert's rule. Now, we've already said Hebert was a caretaker government, okay? So there's a strong argument that Hebert's rule was not revolutionary, which is what Lee is arguing. So Hebert, the new chancellor, never intended to bring about any fundamental change to Germany. Okay, it was always his intention when the Republic was declared on the 9th of November. On the 9th of November 1918, to run a temporary caretaker government until a National Assembly could be elected that would decide upon a future constitution. And we know that he was irritated by his deputy, Philip Scheidemann, who declared on the 9th of November that Germany was a republic. Hebert felt that was not Scheidemann's decision to make, but because he stood on the balcony and declared it to the crowds, so Hebert could not really backtrack on that, but he felt that that was an unconstitutional declaration. The decision about whether Germany was a republic or whether it continued to be a monarchy should have been made by the National Assembly that hadn't been elected at that particular point. It wasn't elected until January. So in the short term, from November until 1918 until January, until the National Assembly met, Hebert reluctantly agreed to share decision making with the Council of People's Representatives, which was kind of like a big Soviet. It was elected by the local Soviets in Berlin, but he only ever saw that as a short-term arrangement. In the meantime, he was determined to rein in the Soviets and prevent them pursuing a radical path. More on that in a bit below. Hebert's attitude was also consistent with the whole development of the SPD before 1918, which, as you know, had always been evolutionary rather than revolutionary. It had always been a force for stability and continuity. It had never really been anti-Kaiser. It had always wanted to work with the monarchy. So again, some evidence for that. Before 1900, the revolutionary minority within the SPD were outnumbered by the evolutionary mainstream members. The revolutionary minority were the USPD. And the USPD, of course, broke away during World War One, and the evolutionary majority, now called the MSPD, stuck to their belief that a reformed version of the Constitution was preferable to a Marxist revolution. In other words, the majority SPD, of which Hebert was the leader, were convinced evolutionaries prepared to take any measure to prevent revolution. A useful quote by Lee there. And that explains the Hebert-Groener Pact of the 10th of November 1918. There's also a strong argument that Hebert and the MSPD exaggerated the threat from the Spartacists in January 1919, and therefore swung too readily into a counter-revolutionary position to prevent a revolution by signing the Hebert-Groener Pact, and that there really wasn't a revolution that was happening. So in a sense, historians have been sort of like fooled by Hebert's overstating the case. As a result, Hebert was so preoccupied with preventing the Spartacists from succeeding that he missed a genuine opportunity to reform society. The opportunity was there, but he didn't miss it. And an example of that is given 6th of December. Hebert made a half-hearted attempt to change the nature of the army into being a people's army, but he caved in very quickly to Groener, who resisted all attempts to change the army. And Groener obviously wanted to keep the army very much as a Prussian army dominated by the upper classes, or dominated by the old upper classes, who were not removed from power, in the army at least, although they have lost political power. Okay, and then finally, Lee then moves on. Okay, so having pretty much established that that after the failed Spartacus uprising, which in itself arguably was not revolutionary, Germany then moved into an evolutionary path rather than a revolutionary path. Lee then proposes that actually you could take it even further and argue that Hebert's rule as President of Germany from January 1919 to May 1919 was actually counter-revolutionary, in the sense that, arguably the new republic was simply the old Kaiserreich rebranded. There were many residual influences and structures from the Second Reich, and there are 4 examples of that continuity. Okay, so a useful little summary there of those continuities. First of all, the constitution of the Weimar Republic, when it was actually pronounced by the National Assembly, was a compromise. It was simply the old Second Reich constitution modified by the October reforms introduced by Prince Max. Article 1, for example, even said the German Reich is a republic, which is very telling. Most of the moderate parties of the Second Reich, of the Kaiserreich, that formed the very first coalition government of the new Weimar Republic, were pretty much transferred into the Republic unchanged. They simply changed their names, if anything. So the progressive liberals of the Second Reich now changed their name to the German Democrats, but they were the same party beneath. The national liberals of the Second Reich now changed their name to the German People's Party, but they were the same party beneath. And of course the SPD and the Centre Party didn't even make any changes to their name, they just transferred over to the Weimar Republic. So again, another argument that the Weimar Republic was really the Second Reich, just rebranded. There were no structural changes, as you know. Beneath the surface, the old civil service, the judiciary, and of course the German army were largely unchanged. Okay, the only significant changes were at the top. Okay, obviously the Kaiser stepping down and the individual princes and kings who ruled the state governments stepping down. That was obviously a significant change, but structurally, the machinery of government continued unchanged. And there, of course, is the final point about the army continuing virtually unchanged. Hebert and Groener made the decision that the army would not be republicanized. The entire old apparatus were allowed to go on operating without let or hindrance, a quote by Heber. So the conclusion there, a revolutionary situation without a revolution. If there was a revolution, it did not revolutionise. Useful quote for you to learn there. Okay, I've got to stop there because I've gone over the 15 minutes. Hopefully YouTube will accept this. Thank you.